I'd like to welcome all of you to our session today. This is part of the international scene, which has been going on here at Hofstra for many, many decades. For those of you I don't know, I'm Linda Longmire, I'm a professor in the Global Studies Department. And of course, I want to thank our, particularly the CCE's Institute for Peace Studies for sponsoring this event, along with, of course, the Long Island Alliance for Peaceful Alternatives and the Cultural Center. Before we begin with our very important program today, and welcome back our speaker, Dr. Trita Parsi, I think we probably all want to just take a moment to reflect on both the compassion and courage of what's going on in Ukraine, which is in many ways emblematic of so many conflicts around the world. And again, important to recognize, yes, of course, the extraordinary courage of the Ukrainian citizens and army, but at the same time to think about those very brave protesters in Russia who are speaking truth to power or trying to, as well as those, even those conscripted and unwilling and unknowing Russian soldiers who are also being victimized by what's going on here. So in any case, let's just take one moment to think about all of that those waves of courage and compassion going on, the refugees, which again are emblematic of refugees all over the world. Thank you. Before we begin, I want to just tell you about some other upcoming events that I think will be of interest and are becoming urgently important. The second in our international scene series will be on March 31st, when we will have Stephen Wertheim, who is a senior fellow at the Carnegie Institute for International Peace. That will be a virtual event, again, March 31st. So check out the Cultural Center to register for that. We're really looking forward to that as well, because he's also going to talk about kind of US global strategy and US foreign policy. Tomorrow, the World, it's called. And then also a couple other events coming up on the 7th, on March 7th, next Monday. There'll be a campus discussion, I think sort of old school teach-in style. And that will be in the Cultural Center Theater from 1 to 2:25. Very important. We'll have a variety of speakers as people try to sort out what is going on. So please attend that. And then a virtual event on March 14th, the following Monday, from 11:20 to 12:40. And that will be on Ukraine in the crosshairs. So look for that as well. Again, as we all try to sort out what is going on in this troubled planet and troubled species. Again, I think we all feel such enormous concern for students who are not only grappling with this and an understanding, a kind of shock about what's going on politically and globally, as well as having dealt with the pandemic, as well as dealing with environmental meltdown. These are times that do require great courage to face that reality. As some of you know, my favorite quote is always Gramsci: we have to think pessimistically, but act optimistically, or rather than pessimistically, perhaps realistically, but continue to act to hopefully change the planet and change some of these urgent, sometimes cataclysmic issues. In any case, in that spirit, we are grateful for the return visit of Dr. Trita Parsi, who has been here before. So welcome back again. Many of you know his work. He's the author of 3 books. He's one of the real experts on US foreign policy in this global context. He's also the vice president of the Quincy Institute for Responsible Statecraft. Have we ever needed responsible statecraft more than today? Probably not. He's won numerous awards as an expert, of course, again, not only on the Middle East, but also on, again, these global patterns, global issues as well. He's been called by the Washingtonian Magazine one of the 50 most influential voices on foreign policy in DC. So we're really grateful that he's here to share some of that wisdom. And of course, probably one of the ultimate compliments, the inimitable Noam Chomsky has said that he is probably one of the most distinguished scholars on Iran. But again, his expertise is even broader. And so we are really grateful that he's here, that he's returned, and that he's going to share some of his insights and wisdom. I assume a bit also on the Ukrainian situation, since that's what we're all focused on at the moment. So please join me in whatever way we can. Do we clap? Yes, I guess, for welcoming Dr. Trita Parsi back to Hofstra. Thanks again.
Thank you so much. This is the first applaud I've ever gotten on Zoom, so that's great. Thank you so much for that warm welcome. These are indeed extremely problematic and worrisome times. I'm very glad that you mentioned our effort to try to design a better path forward through responsible statecraft. Very delighted to hear that Stephen will be speaking at Hofstra later this month. He is one of the co-founders of my institute and a great friend. And I know that right now, everyone's mind is on what's happening in Ukraine. This is a terrible, terrible situation. This is an illegal war. This is an act of aggression by Putin that certainly deserves massive punishment and reversal. And we have to be very careful that this does not lead to a new situation in which more states start to believe that they can set aside international law and norms whenever it pleases them. We have lived in a world, we have to be honest, in which for the last 20 years, or 25 or so years, it's the United States that has been able to act in this manner, and some states close to the United States. In fact, looking at what is happening in Ukraine right now is not terribly different from what happened in Iraq 2003. It was also an illegal invasion and occupation. In what is kind of scary right now, if you look at what the Russian foreign minister said today, he said that they needed to invade Ukraine in order to stop them before they built a nuclear weapon. The language starts to increasingly echo what we heard about Iraq. And I think this is a reminder to us that when those international laws and norms are broadly broken down, that will backfire on all of us, including ourselves here in the United States, who at the end of the day do need a system of international rules, a rules-based system to make ourselves safe. We cannot just rely on our military. The difference is, of course, that we are in a situation in which the very notion of a rules-based order has become increasingly hollow, and it became even more so after Putin did what he did. I would point to the symbolics of what he did, because he did it in the middle of the Security Council extra session on Ukraine. I was in the Security Council working there for the Swedish government, what is now 25 years ago, in which we had a somewhat similar situation. Just to give you a quick anecdote, this was back in the days when the Clinton administration was enforcing sanctions through the UN, no-fly zone and other things in Iraq, and there was a belief that Saddam Hussein had not given up all of his nuclear weapons, and there were inspections and other concerns taking place there. There was a report coming out by an envoy for the UN Security Council, for the Secretary General Butler, an Australian diplomat, if I'm not mistaken. And we had an extra session at the Security Council in the back room, the one that you will never see on TV, on this matter. And the perspective of most of the states was that we should take into account what Butler's report says and then make a decision what our decision will be. The interpretation of the United States was that because Saddam had violated some of the restrictions that had been put on him, the automatic response was to take military action. This was disputed by others. In the middle of our meeting, and Lavrov, by the way, who was the current foreign minister, was then the UN ambassador. In the middle of our meeting, breaking news comes on CNN that the bombing has already started. And we all went into another room where CNN was on. It's a room where other diplomats that are not part of the P5 or part of the Security Council gather to figure out what actually the deliberations amongst the Security Council members have reached. And we're all watching it in the middle of the Security Council meeting that is supposed to decide whether to take military action or not, or whatever the action would be. We have been in a process for the last 25, 30 years in which I fear, particularly after the Iraq War, we've seen the UN, the rules-based order increasingly becoming hollow. The UN is increasingly weak, if not irrelevant. I think it's fascinating that today, it's not just that the UN Secretary General is next to invisible on this issue. Under normal circumstances, the first person one would think of to step in and help mediate an end to this conflict would be the UN Security Council, UN Secretary General. What's more fascinating is that no one even noticing that he's invisible, because no one even thinks of the Secretary General and the role that he and the UN as a whole should be playing. I think those are all very worrisome developments in which it has now been further enforced with what the illegal war that Putin has started, and it brings us into an increasingly anarchic world system that will make it much less safe for all of us. This is then happening in the context of a reality that has been acknowledged by the Biden administration, which is that ultimately, as bad as many of these things are, and they're very, very bad, we should not belittle them, the existential threats we are facing right now are actually climate and pandemics, meaning non-military, common threats that all of humanity faces together. And for us to be able to address those effectively, particularly climate, we need to have a completely different degree of international solidarity and collaboration to be able to have any chance to be able to address those. We are still in a situation in which almost on a daily basis now, we have roughly 9/11 number of American deaths a day from a pandemic in which the military, nukes, or anything else have proven to be completely useless. And on top of that, of course, with climate, which is, we will have no chance of being able to address that effectively unless we can have a far greater degree of collaboration between all great powers. US and China primarily, mindful of the fact that US and China are also the two biggest polluters in the world. We cannot get that going. If we end up in a Cold War with Russia or with China or both, we may be able to win that Cold War as we won the last one, but the question is if there's a planet left to win that on. Now, given all of this, one could perhaps wonder as to whether this is a major change in the trend that we have seen in the US for the last 10 years, in which increasingly the American public, even the American foreign policy establishment, are starting to become more hesitant about the idea that the role of the United States internationally is to play the role of a policeman and enforce rules, which means that the United States will take unilateral military action, oftentimes outside of the legitimacy of the US system, and that there's now a shock with what the Russians have done, in which the United States is going to go back into a posture of thinking that the only way to make America and the world safe in this new environment is for the United States to return to a primacy strategy, grand strategy in the world, which means essentially we have to dominate the globe militarily in order to check forces such as Putin or the Chinese or others, because otherwise, if they're not checked by overwhelming American dominance and power, they will be doing exactly what they have been doing in Ukraine, and we will see more of that. That is without a doubt going to be one of the impulses in DC. We're already hearing it. But I think if you scratch the surface, I would make the argument that we're actually not seeing a change in the trend. It will be a messy situation, but some core things seems to be still in play. So let me take a couple of steps back and talk about what I think we can say we are seeing happening in the United States in the course of the last 10, 15 years. We are now in a situation in which a generation of Americans have grown up only with bad wars. From Iraq to Libya to Syria, all of these conflicts have impoverished the United States, has not made the world safer, has not made the United States safer. They were oftentimes without justification, oftentimes without congressional authorization, as a result illegal by the US Constitution, and oftentimes, of course, not with international legitimacy either. A generation of Americans, many of you who are now on this Zoom call, will likely have a standard of living that is lower than that of your parents to a very large extent. That is because of the cost of the American grand strategy of thinking that we make ourselves and the world safer by dominating the world militarily. We have a military budget that is far greater than the next 10 major military powers combined. We have roughly 750 military bases around the world. The next biggest competitors in the realm of having military bases abroad are the Russians and the French. They have 9 each. The Chinese, who we talk about a lot, have 2. That is not to say that it's good that they have those. It's to say that there is an overwhelming disparity when it comes to our military posture globally compared to some of these other potential competitor states. If we continue to pursue a strategy of dominating every piece of the planet militarily, then we will always be at war somewhere all the time. That is the lesson I think a lot of Americans have drawn over the course of the last 20 years. The concept of endless war did not even exist just 10 years ago. But we have seen in the course of the last 2 presidential cycles how that language has been adopted by both the left and the right. In the last Democratic primaries, almost all of, with the exception of 1 or 2 of the Democratic candidates, argued for a complete withdrawal from the Middle East in terms of military forces. This is very, very different from what the language was just 1 or 2 presidential cycles ago. This, at the end of the day, I think is a political reaction to a reality that has been brewing out in the country for more than a decade, which is that the public is overwhelmingly turning away from the idea of the United States playing that dominant military role globally, being involved in these endless wars, and thinking that the structure of military bases and engagements is ultimately to the benefit of the United States, or that it is even actually addressing the most pressing needs that the American public has. Some, of course, have taken those sentiments, in my view, and perversed them, turned them into an ugly nationalism, an ugly American first type of rhetoric. But part of the reason why they managed to do so was because the political establishment, by and large, was pretty late in recognizing that those sentiments are out there and those sentiments will not go anywhere. So the first one who managed to channel them managed to also then shape them, or at least shape the language around them in a way that I think has been tremendously helpful. But that person, Donald Trump, did not invent these sentiments. These sentiments were there as a result of US foreign policy. If more American politicians had spoken to these things a bit earlier, it would perhaps have been channeled in a much more constructive way. Let me give you a couple of pieces of data to explain a little bit where I think the American public is aligned. According to polls primarily done by groups such as the Eurasia Foundation group that's been doing this since 2016 on a yearly basis, they're showing some very interesting trend lines. Right now, twice as many Americans want to decrease the defense budget than increase it. This is particularly strong among younger Americans. And again, there's a reason for that I think I already covered. Only roughly 20% of the American public supported the US acting unilaterally and militarily to stop human rights abuses overseas. This is a huge shift. Those numbers were closer to 50% just a few years ago. What we've seen is that those numbers have really dropped down and they keep on dropping down. It is not because the younger generation does not believe that human rights needs to be upheld. On the contrary, I think they're very committed to the concepts of human rights and their importance in international relations. What has changed is the belief that military force is the solution to ending human rights abuses abroad. A majority, as a result, have now become skeptical of humanitarian intervention and have instead, in these polls, are favoring military restraint and reliance on multilateral organizations in order to address those things. A Washington Post, and this was also very fascinating because we saw that with Biden leaving Afghanistan, and the manner in which that was done, which was clearly highly, highly problematic and quite embarrassing, frankly, one would have thought that perhaps that would have turned the American public against the decision to pull out in the first place. And whereas that is clearly the case amongst many elements in Washington, outside of Washington, the broader country, there was no trends in the polls, and there were numerous polls that were produced about this that seemed to indicate that. On the contrary, actually, the manner in which it was done, as well as some of the attacks by ISIS, etc., tended to strengthen the belief amongst the public that this was the right decision, however much they may have disagreed with the manner in which Biden was doing it, and poor planning and many other things. So the Washington Post ABC News poll in September 21 showed that a solid majority of 78% supported the decision to withdraw, despite or perhaps even because of the horrible ISIS attacks at Kabul airport. What I think all of this is pointing to is a trend in which, particularly amongst younger Americans, they want the United States to become what I would call a normal country that engages in trade and diplomacy, because incidentally, all of the polls show that the particularly younger Americans do not want to go back to some variation of isolationism. On the contrary, they want to be extremely engaged in the world. They're overwhelmingly in favor of going back to all of the different treaties that the Trump administration pulled out of, from JCPOA to Paris to many others, support above 65% for almost all of those. But a normal country means that you engage in trade and diplomacy, and you limit the use of force to protecting the homeland rather than policing the world, while seeking to inspire other nations through, not through force, but through the example of America itself, the strength of its example. And one element that I think is further showing how the generational gap is taking away some of the building blocks of the previous policy of thinking that the United States has to be quite aggressively active in interventions abroad, is to see where the younger generation is on the concept of American exceptionalism compared to older generations. A 2020 poll by the Eurasia Group Foundation shows that while 3/4 of Americans older than 60 years still regard the United States as an exceptional nation, only 46.4% of Americans aged 18 to 29 share that sentiment. That doesn't mean that they're not patriotic. That doesn't mean that they don't love their country. But this belief that there's something exceptional about the United States that then destines it to play that role internationally of being the policeman, being the world hegemon, you're seeing a critical component, ideological component that is almost necessary in order to reach that later conclusion, starting to wither away amongst the younger American population. Now, has Ukraine changed all of that? I think, again, on the surface level, you're going to see a resurgence of those who will make the argument that if the United States had just been strong and stayed in Afghanistan and all of those different things, Putin would never have done that. And that we have no choice but to pursue a grand strategy of primacy with which all of these different interventions come. Because if we don't, we're going to be under the thumb of Putin or later on by the Chinese. You will definitely hear that. But take a close look at what Biden has done and has not done. He's made it very clear from day one, the United States is not going to send troops to defend Ukraine. We have no treaty obligation to do so. And despite all of the efforts that the Biden administration has done to deter Putin, putting American troops was taken off the table from day one in the clearest possible way. It was reiterated again yesterday in the State of the Union. At the same time, he's very clear the United States will defend every inch of NATO because the United States actually has an Article 5 obligation to do so. There's a treaty there, and the US has an obligation to do so. But he's not extending that to go beyond the countries that are not part of NATO. And this is very important because the conversation in Washington right now is to go for no-fly zone and all of these other things that the United States has no obligation to do because we have no defense pact with the Ukrainians. And he is staying away from that. He's doing everything he can with massive sanctions, central bank sanctions, things that I'm confident have shocked Putin. He did not expect this, and it will likely have an impact on how Russia goes forward with its decisions. But he's staying very clear of the line in which the United States would actually get itself involved militarily into something that it doesn't have a defense obligation to do. Had it not been for the sentiments of the American public on this issue, had it not been for the way that the public continues to be very skeptical about further interventions, I'm not so sure that Biden would have chosen this path. He is adjusting to the reality that the American public still doesn't want to go in this direction, despite what Putin has done, but instead is trying to prevent Putin from doing these things without committing the United States to military interventions that is not obligated to do. Now, of course, there's a very significant risk that things can spill out of control, that you will have a situation in which the escalatory steps by both sides that are short of war nevertheless lead to war. There are huge risks that this could spill over into cyber. We don't have a clear structure of law of how to deal with cyber in the sense of what is an act of war, what is not. There's a huge gray zone there that is very, very dangerous because it begs for escalation and loss of control. We also, of course, have the nuclear situation, and despite Putin's language about putting his missiles, his weapons on high alert, etc., we've seen the Biden administration be very, very careful and not walking into the trap of getting engaged in some sort of a silly rhetorical match with the Russians over nukes. Again, very clear about not involving the United States in these things. A complete rejection of the no-fly zones precisely because it would, by definition, drag the United States into that war. The United States would be obligated to shoot down Russian planes. It is not going to do that because it knows it actually brings the United States into that war. So I think what we're seeing is that it's going to be a messy world. And in that messy world, there's going to be new challenges. And the United States is right now recognizing, and at least with this administration, that just naked, unthoughtful escalation is not to its benefit, that it needs to deter, reverse many of these Russian moves, but to do so short of military action, and while at the same time reinforcing that there is a value to signing a defense treaty with the United States. The United States will uphold those obligations, unlike Trump that wanted to walk away from them without a renegotiation. But it also then means that if you haven't signed a defense pact with the United States, then you can also not expect that the United States automatically is going to come to your support militarily. Because if that is the case, and we have plenty of examples in the last 10, 15 years in which people have made the case that we have to do so, whether it is to protect the Kurds in Syria or other things, it essentially eliminates the very value of signing a defense pact with the United States if the United States is going to act as if it is militarily and morally obligated to step in every military conflict. That very much was the case before. I think it's a clear trend that it's not the case any longer, despite, and in some aspects, even perhaps because of what has happened in Ukraine. I'll stop there. Thank you so much.
Thanks so much. Thanks so much. And next we're going to turn to Professor Stephanie Nanis, who's a professor in the political science department and an expert also on the Middle East, as well as international policy, for some comments, questions, reactions. Stephanie?
Okay, thanks, Linda. And thank you so much, Dr. Parsi, for being with us today. That was really interesting. I'm really glad you pointed to all the generational. That's going to be some really great stuff to talk about. My Middle East politics class, they should be here. I see one of them has turned on her camera, so hopefully the rest of them are here. That should be some really rich conversation, especially since we will spend a lot of time on the American invasion of Iraq. So when I was looking at the title and the description, the divide I sort of walked down to look more closely at is the partisan one in the United States, Democrats and Republicans, and particularly I don't know if it's really a debate within the maybe it's a debate within the Republican Party, or the kind of catfight, I guess, in the Republican Party, and particularly the elements that you made reference to the isolationist elements. And I just have a couple of quotes that really caught my attention. Well, particularly one from, okay, Marjorie Taylor Greene, who is not a person I turn to for, you know, of the gazpacho police. And apparently now she's going to white supremacists. So she's not someone I turn to for, you know, political commentary, but she did make an a tweet that I thought was revealing. And the tweet was, "What is with these neocons drooling over our 18-year-old men getting blown to pieces in war?" Right? Now the neocons are gone. And for students here, we might have to define what neocons are, but the complaint, right, that complaint would resonate with her base. And that there's a lot of sort of what Republicans, the GOP base, the ones who have adopted all the other anti-immigrant white supremacy stuff, that isolationism comes, it seems to me, and I guess I'd be curious to hear your response, comes from the fact that it was their sons and now it's their, you know, they were the ones who were going to fight these wars that, you know, in Afghanistan and Iraq, which were widely seen as failures. And I think here you have something, they're not opposed to them because they were wrong, which is the situation on the left, which is where I was 20 years ago. Like, you know, those wars were wrong, immoral, unethical, right? Their argument comes from, well, we didn't win. But, you know, I think that in a way, or it appears to me, and I'd be curious to hear from other, you know, students and professors, that we're finally seeing the political blowback from those wars. Like that it took some time to percolate down, and for there to be some political learning, I guess, if we could call it that. But it looks like we're again sort of finally seeing that again lesson sinking in. Now, and I guess I don't have much else to add. I have another, you know, good quote from another isolationist Republican who's running in Ohio, J.D. Vance, who wrote the Hillbilly Elegy. You know, he's running for Senate in Ohio, and his argument, again, not my favorite person or whatever, but instructive in terms of how a significant or some segment of the American population, or at least the Republican Party, is thinking, as you said, the belief that the fate of Ukraine is none of America's concern, right? So then we have a complete withdrawal from American involvement in the world, which is different than what you described young people wanting as an America engaged, right? So this is a complete withdrawal of America. He's more concerned about illegal immigration, so this is diverting it. But the last one, which also might be worth us talking about, the claim is that, you know, corrupt elites have conspired to embroil America in pointless wars, right? So I think that, I don't know, I'll just close this again. This is sort of me thinking about the internal fight within the Republican Party. Is that rage, I mean, literally rage against the price that was paid for those wars and who bore it, is in some ways getting directed at the Republican elite, or Republican establishment. But again, as you mentioned, and I'll close here with all of this other stuff, all this, but I can't remember the word, nasty, ugly, I think was like truly ugly, like the anti-immigrant white supremacy, but then it's gotten attached to that. Yeah. But the fact that it extends beyond this particular fringe group, and I hope that the people you described, the young, the ones that you described are certainly more numerous than the Marjorie Taylor Greene followers. So thanks very much for coming.
Thanks, Stephanie. Thanks, appreciate that. Dr. Parsi, do you want to respond, or shall we turn to Professor Eisenberg?
I would love to respond if that's
Yes.
okay. And
Please,
that's,
please.
yeah.
Oh, yes. We should let him respond. I mean, I think Stephanie said a lot and, touched on key issues. And
Yeah.
the truth is that I'm going to have more questions than answers.
I have some of those too, but I thought and we'll wait for students, right? So.
Yeah,
Right. So I would like to have to hear your thoughts.
Great.
Very good. Thank you. Those are very, very interesting and good observations. Let me say a couple of things. I want to somewhat repeat what I said earlier on. These sentiments amongst the public, whatever the root is, the left who from the outset viewed this as illegal and immoral, the right who believed the Bush administration, but then later on realized that they had been lied to. I don't think it's just because it failed, it's because it was a lie and they lost a lot of their sons and daughters to the war. Combine that with the financial crisis, combine that we've had 25 years of neoliberal growth that essentially is growing based on inequality, and a larger and larger number of people, particularly out in the country, feel that they're left behind. All of these different things have created a massive amount of discontent that I don't think is just directed at the Republican Party or the neocons. It's directed to the elite as a whole. And that had not been addressed either on the left or the right. On the left, to the extent that it had been addressed, had been by Bernie Sanders, and those very same people tend to also be very much against an American grand strategy of global hegemony. On the right, it had not been. And when Trump went in, was it the South or North Carolina primaries, and he's standing there next to 15 other people seeking the presidency, the Bush family is in the audience. And he goes on a massive rail against them and trashes them for the wars that they had caused. And what did the Washington elite believe? And the predictions was, this is the end of Trump. He's never going to survive this, going after the very well established and respected Bush family within the Republican Party. Instead, it seemed to have had the exact opposite effect, because the establishment had completely underestimated the extremely strong anti-war sentiment that exists on the right as well. It may be for the different reasons than what we saw on the left, but it's there. Since no one was willing to channel that energy, to talk to them about their sentiments, their perspective, it was left to someone like Donald Trump. And he would do it to serve his own purposes. He is by no means a restrainer who actually believes in these things. If you take a look at his policies, particularly in the Middle East, it's been the opposite in many examples. But he managed to grasp that energy because no one else did. And he turned it into something much, much ugly. Because again, going back to the polls, there's nothing in the polls that indicate that type of a sentiment, including amongst younger Republicans, that they're against international trade or against international agreements, etc. On the contrary, they're all in favor of that. It's all the indications of wanting to have a normal country. I would push back a little bit against, I think, this idea that this is a fight between either isolationists who just want to cut off ties with the rest of the world and hide, and on the other hand, what we already have seen for the last 25 years. I think that's a false dichotomy. Very few people actually really, even on the fringes, identify with what would truly be an isolationist, which is really cutting themselves off from the rest of the world. There's a huge middle part there, which is a normal country. You engage in trade, you engage in diplomacy, but when it comes to using your military force, primarily that is to protect the homeland. If you use it in other instances, the bar needs to be much, much higher than it is. Does anyone on this call know what our national interest is in Yemen that justifies not only the Obama administration, the Trump administration, and now the Biden administration continuing and intensifying that war? What is the national interest that is at stake at the United States that justifies the use of force, that justifies servicing the Saudi military to continue that carnage and the worst humanitarian crisis? There is no such thing. No one in Washington has been able to answer it. Whatever the answer is, well, because it's good for the Saudis, or we have to push back against the Iranians. I'm not asking about that. What's the US interest? That has been left unaddressed. And there is a foreign policy that is well established that could address those things without going into any of the extremisms of global hegemony or the extremisms of that type of isolationism that is, again, it's perhaps a fringe within the fringe. I would be arguing in favor of that. Thank you.
Great. We have a couple of questions before I turn to Professor Eisenberg, who will have some important questions and follow-up comments. But let me mention those so they can be woven into the conversation as well. And again, this is, of course, questions about Ukraine. One is that military intervention helps combat people destroying countries. If we really care about the world, wouldn't we help them fight? And then a history question as well. Does Biden's reluctance to act unless Article 5 is triggered play into Putin's hands? And considering comparisons made to Hitler in the UN Assembly, what would US response be if Russia subsequently attacks Georgia? Two questions that again speak to the complexity of the and questions about intervention. Let's turn to Professor Eisenberg, who has some additional questions. Of course, all of you know Professor Carolyn Eisenberg in the history department, and she will have some additional comments and questions, and then we will open things up for your further questions and comments from the audience. And so you can send those either via the chat or the hand raising function as well. Carolyn?
Yes, I realize as this event has progressed that I'm uncharacteristically reluctant to speak. And that's because this is the first optimistic person I've heard in weeks that thinks that some things are going well. So why intervene with that, that view? And really, I am left with a number of questions, and I'm eager to have students participate as well. One smaller, not really smaller question, one question that you did not speak to, which it would be very helpful if you would, which is about the Iran Treaty and what the likelihood is now that that is going to get negotiated and that's going to prove to be acceptable within the United States officialdom. So I would like to ask you, if you would comment on that. Part of it's interesting that in your perspective, and I may not be understanding it properly, that it seems as though you are assuming that this public opinion that is reluctant to be involved in military activity, especially in places that seem peripheral, that is going to have a big influence on policy. And I'm wondering why you think that. I mean, I do believe that public opinion can matter. And I think it particularly matters when you have a mobilized public, around a particular issue. But the sort of vague idea of, no, we shouldn't do things that aren't our business, I don't know that that's so powerful. And I want to even raise it kind of in line with the questions I'm seeing in the chat. I know that when you were speaking about the State of the Union address last night, that you were especially highlighting Biden's restraint, all the things that he said he wouldn't do. But watching that performance, I think as well that people take away from it the idea not only that Ukraine is vital to our national interest, which personally I'm not really sure that that's the case, but also that if you came away from that speech, was the president or the people in that room or Americans watching, on their television, are people prepared to have a situation where the Russians come into Kyiv and they overthrow the government and maybe kill the president and, announce a variety of changes and that they're planning to leave, sometime or other. And, when you look at what's occurring, I mean, it seems that the most probable thing is that they're going to successfully overthrow that government. And if that occurs, given the whipping up of feeling about the Ukrainians, and it should be whipped up. I mean, I think people all over the world are looking at Ukrainians who are fighting for their country. I mean, what could be more inspiring than that? But are we also then prepared to have that effort and that inspiration, and then see the Russians stifle it. Once you've already told the American people, which the president is telling the American people, that this is vital to all of us, is it then possible to refrain from military action as things proceed further? So I think that's one of my major questions. And sort of related to that, you know, I, as a historian, when I look at what's happened, you know, since the ending of the Cold War, which had so much of a potential to change, to be a game changer, to really have powers demilitarized, to have negotiation and diplomacy, you know, genuinely take the place of different countries threatening each other and fighting in third world settings. So much promise there. And yet, I think what's really striking is that from the 90s forward, that one reason or another has existed for the United States to involve itself in a military way. And obviously, you know, the particular thing that people are talking about right now is relevant was the decision to expand NATO, right? In which a whole range of experts in the field said very clearly, this is a huge mistake. It may be the worst mistake, that you're setting a situation in which, you know, you're going to get the Cold War back. It might not happen in 2 years or 5 years or 8 years, but that you're doing something that's very dangerous. And then, you know, you see that the number of US interventions that followed and the overreaction to the war, to the attack here in the United States, of going to war in 2 countries and being in those 2 countries for 20 years. I mean, I think what's striking is the extent to which we always have to have an enemy. And there's always a reason, if not to fight, to threaten, to build up, to spend more money on the military. I mean, the reality is that at a time when the Congress cannot find the funds, you know, to pay for childcare, or to enable people to stay home when someone's sick in their family, or to have hearing aids for senior citizens. I mean, these absurd things that we don't have the money for. The defense budget, you know, even pre-Ukraine, of $770 billion has gone through without virtually a peep, and with most of the Democratic Party, you know, accepting that. And now Biden's asked for even more money for the defense. So I guess what I'm saying, and I'm really, again, I feel reluctant because you're giving us some good news, and we could certainly use it. But honestly, I don't see at this point what there is to restrain US militarism if you do not have a mobilized public, not an annoyed public, but a mobilized public. I don't see what it is that's going to pull back this emphasis. And also, just in my less unpleasant remark, to include this, I mean, I think there's a great worry about Taiwan, right? And even before Ukraine, that was heating up. There are some reasons to fear that the Chinese are going to look at that situation in Ukraine and sees that as a moment where they may take action with respect to Taiwan. And if there's no serious American effort to, you know, somewhat improve relationships with the Chinese, which I don't think is present now, you know, how does that situation get managed? So everybody could pretend that I didn't say any of this because you've given us something to hope for. But I really am, you know, wondering about your thoughts about, you know, both the narrow question of the Iran Treaty, but the larger question of how do we restrain US militarism, and is people being annoyed, grumpy, dissatisfied, is that adequate to really check the trends that are operating right now?
Great. Trita?
Thank you so much. First of all, if I provided any optimism or hope, please forgive me. My apologies. That was not my intent.
We need it. I think everyone's feeling frightened enough, you know, very distressed at what we're seeing.
I think you provided excellent questions and a good reality check. You're absolutely right that there is need for a constraint that is much stronger than annoyance. But this is where I think the landscape has shifted. Right now, I think the administration knows very well it would be foolish for it to act in such a way in which it takes a status quo of annoyance and translates that into a mobilized public. This is the administration that came out with the idea of a foreign policy for the middle class. You tell me how any further escalation with direct escalation with Russia that would involve the United States would serve the American middle class in the manner that the administration spelled out and Jake Sullivan did on his first press conference. And he worked on this for 2-3 years while he was out of office. They recognize very well that constraint. What they're trying to do, in my estimation, is to operate without challenging that constraint in a way, because they recognize that the propensity for that annoyance to be translated into mobilization is far greater now than it was 25 years ago. And as a result, they have to operate much more carefully than they did otherwise. Otherwise, if they go too far, you will end up in a situation in which politically this will be extremely challenging for them. Now, can there be other elements that come into play? I mean, if you have a massive bombardment of Kiev, which unfortunately does not seem unlikely, on the contrary, unfortunately seems quite likely, and you have those images coming out, it certainly will have an impact on the public. But what the administration seems to have been trying to do so far is to put forward the maximum amount of pressure and deterrence that they can, while itself not being in the lead militarily. It has done a tremendous amount of work to get the Europeans to step up in manners that they likely would never have done. In fact, what has happened almost on a daily basis, that something happened that no one expected could have happened at all, and within 24 hours, each one of those red lines are going away. Is that sufficient to prevent this from escalating into something in which, unfortunately, all of these constraints will be blown away? No, it's not. But if this had happened 15 years ago, under different circumstances, I think you would have seen a very different American response than what you're seeing right now. And I think that counts for something. We have to better understand what that is, how that impacts things, and if there potentially is even some degree of hope in that. Jumping over to the Iran agreement, they are in some of the toughest negotiations right now. And what I was told just a couple of hours ago is that essentially 2 more days, either it fails or it succeeds. One of the most critical issues right now is PMDs, what is called the previous military dimensions, essentially what the Iranians did before that likely are a violation. We can be pretty confident that there are violations, and the way this was handled in the previous agreement was that essentially because Iran came clean on what it's going to do going forward, that issue was not was not classified as resolved. It was classified that the IAEA had asked questions and it was satisfied with the answers. And it was as close to a closing that you could get. It's now been reopened. This is what the Israelis are pushing for very much. They don't want it to be closed. They don't want it to be satisfied. What the Iranians want is very much for it to be closed, because otherwise they think that even though they agree to all of these other restrictions, there will constantly be this issue to reopen this issue and push them for more and more. But even if that gets resolved, this is where I think the big difference is between now and 2015. Even if this gets resolved and there's a deal by this weekend, this is not going to be the same 2015 agreement, in the sense that in 2015, as difficult as it was a very different atmosphere. The two sides came in with it with confidence that the deal could last. They had confidence that if the other side tried to cheat, there would be elements and mechanisms to prevent that from happening. And they had confidence that there was a basis to build on this deal and move towards other issues and expand the diplomacy with Iran to go beyond the nuclear issue. In essence, what it was a change in the trajectory of US-Iran relations. Not in the sense that suddenly US and Iran had become friends and everything was fine, but take a look at what happened when a couple of American Marines accidentally got into Iranian waters in the Persian Gulf just a couple of hours or days before the implementation of the nuclear deal. That issue was resolved through 5 phone calls directly between Zarif and John Kerry. Zarif is the Iranian foreign minister, within 16 hours. It would have been resolved even faster had it not been nighttime in Iran. Under other circumstances, a case like that would have escalated potentially to the brink of war, but this was resolved. So you had an opportunity there with that basis that this could be a change in the trajectory, and if it had been built upon and invested in and Trump had not pulled out, we would be in a very, very different situation right now. Now I'm saying that it would be normalization, but we would have seen a break in the trend of US-Iran relations constantly going down. This deal is going to be very different. The circumstances are much worse. Mistrust is massive, not just because of what Trump did, but also how the Iranians have perceived some of Biden's actions. Biden could have gone back into the deal on day one through an executive order and resolved whatever remaining issues from within the deal. In fact, some of the worst things that the Iranians have done, they have done in the past year. And those would not have been needed to roll back because the Iranians would have had to give up almost all of their LEU right away as soon as the US stepped back in and would have stopped their 20%, their 60% enrichment of uranium. All of that would have happened automatically. Then there would have been some issues that needed negotiations, but the US could have done it through inside the deal with the moral authority of also having walked back into the deal. It didn't do so. I can go into detail as to why it didn't, but the Iranians perceived this as being an effort by the administration to use Trump sanctions to extract more concessions from the Iranians, something that some Biden officials had argued publicly during the campaign. Well, if the US was going to use Trump sanctions to get more extract more concessions from Iran, then that is essentially the same position as Trump on the negotiations. I want to talk to you. I'm just going to crush your economy in the meantime. Well, the response of the Iranians back then, and then again, once Biden did this, was to escalate the conflict further by expanding their nuclear program. So now, when the two sides are coming to an agreement, it's not just with the bitter experience of the past, it's now with almost no trust. Before there was a fear that the other side would cheat, now there's an expectation that they will. And perhaps most importantly, the Iranians asked for assurances that the US wouldn't pull out of the agreement again once Biden is no longer president. Biden said there's no way that he can provide such guarantees. All of this has left both sides with the impression that this deal will not last more than 2 to 3 years. Rather than being a break in the trend, one in which US-Iran relations could potentially move in a positive direction, it is likely at most going to be a pause, a respite, in which the two sides are going to use the next coming 2 to 3 years to prepare themselves for what they believe will be the coming showdown in 2025. So if you wanted some pessimism to overcome the earlier optimism, there you go.
Great. Again, it's always a balance, isn't it? But a couple of questions that have come in that I'd like to throw into the mix. One more historical and one more strategic, both about the Ukraine, of course. But again, I think what we're trying to tease out are some of these larger macro patterns. The historic one says, you know, is this rhetoric, the Russian rhetoric, comparable to Serbian rhetoric in Kosovo? Where Serbia was also claiming to defend the interests of the Serbs there. And then the second, again, more strategic, is that if the US has done everything within its power in order to deter Russia and punish them, what about, couldn't these two powerful actions be used, one of which would be to stop purchasing Russian oil, which does account for a large amount of Russia's economy. And then the US does have, according to this question, the ability to produce enough oil to offset the lack of Russian oil, especially in America itself. And then additionally, if we had intel saying that Russia was going to invade Ukraine for months, why didn't we sanction them before they invaded instead of waiting until after they had begun the invasion? Two big questions, one looking back, one looking forward.
Thank you so much. On the first question of Serbia, unfortunately, I don't know enough about how the debate went back then to be able to answer if you know the similarities or potential differences between what the Serbs were saying back then and what the Russians are saying today. In regards to what the United States could have done to prevent this, I think, unfortunately, there's a common tendency to think, what could we have done by imposing more sanctions or being tougher here and there? Rarely do we hear people say, what could we have done diplomatically? I think the big missed opportunity was a diplomatic one, in which I think there could have been ways in which this could have been prevented. I think that at the end of this is going to get very ugly and very sad. But I do believe that at the end of it, if any type of solution comes out, there's going to be a solution in which Ukraine has to obviously be an independent and free country, but it's going to also end up becoming a neutral country. And that could have actually been achieved even before all of this happened. So there were the contours of what a final agreement could be was already there. And we could have probably engaged more on that. Perhaps it would have failed, but we don't know now because we didn't. There was some conversations, etc. And yes, the French went there and the Germans had their conversations. But conversations and real thorough through diplomacy and negotiations are two different things. So, but could we have done more in terms of not buying Russian gas or oil or sanctioning before all of this happened? First of all, if we sanction them before all of this happened, what's to stop them from doing what they did? If we're already punishing them for a crime that they haven't committed, the likelihood is that they actually will go forward and commit that crime because they don't see what else they would be paying for. And one of the problems with some of those type of sanctions is, of course, also that we have a terrible track record when it comes to lifting sanctions. Instead of it being seen as a variable in which, well, if they change their behavior, the sanctions get lifted, it ends up becoming seen as a constant. This is, again, one of the challenges in the current Iran negotiations. We lifted some of those sanctions. The Iranians didn't see the full effect of that sanctions relief, but then we reimposed them 2.5 years later because Trump had a bad day. And so as a result, there's a huge risk that the Russians are perceiving these as things that cannot be changed. And as a result, they don't factor it into their calculations any longer. That would have probably been even more the case if we had done it even before they had taken that step. I know this is what the Ukrainians were asking for, but I just don't see examples in history in which things would have worked that way. You're quite right that stopping Russian gas and oil from the international market would have a huge cost on the Russian economy, as well as everything else that has been done so far, which have a huge cost. But the issue is, if you notice what the president was saying yesterday in his State of the Union address, he is very concerned how all of this is going to impact the broader American public. And he was talking about that there's going to be some sacrifices, and he's releasing 30 million or whatever the number was out of the American reserve, and is getting other countries to do so as well. But the administration went to the Saudis before all of this, pushing them to increase production, and the Saudis said no, and they didn't want to do that. And with all of the leverage the United States has over the Saudis, it's stunning to me why we never use it. But the Saudis said no to that. And right now we have gas prices that are very high. It's pushing inflation further up. This will definitely have an impact on the midterm elections. You take Russian gas and oil off of the market, and oil prices would skyrocket. And that would end up really damaging the US, and it would probably end up creating exactly some of those challenges that we talked about in some of the earlier questions. One potential positive, if they succeed, is that if a JCPA is reached and it entails a rather quick return of Iranian oil to the market, that could push down prices 10% rather quickly. And that has not been factored into the current oil prices because there's uncertainty as to whether there would be a deal. But that's the issue. If we engage in this type of economic warfare, it will have costs on both sides. And it's very clear that even the Europeans who have stepped up in terms of agreeing to sanctions that was unthinkable a couple of days ago, nevertheless, they're not cutting off Russian gas because they're in complete need of it.
We've got a broader question about the Ukraine signing their membership application to join the EU, which happened on Monday, and they're now trying to fast track it to get Ukraine into the EU. What would that mean if the EU accepts that application? And is it even possible for Ukraine to get accepted in such a short timeline?
I have significant doubts that they would be able to get in rather short timeline. I think this is an effort by the Europeans to signal that they're not going to allow Ukraine to become the next Belarus, essentially a Russian vassal state, and that Russia would be able to get away with imposing its own regime on Ukraine. But at the end of the day, are the Europeans willing to actually engage in fighting against Russia? We've seen no indications of that whatsoever. It's one thing for the Germans to increase their military budget significantly, but engaging in actual warfare would not seem. I think these are some of the signals in which the two sides are posturing, and at the same time signaling what they will and will not accept in terms of, again, whether the final state of what it would be with Ukraine. The question is, are the two sides willing to accept each other's red lines? One of the red lines for the Russians is that Ukraine needs to be a neutral state. Is it possible to have a Ukraine that is a neutral state, but that is deeply ingrained, integrated into the Western economy and has a free market economy and is an independent state? If one can envision something like that, which perhaps is easier to envision now before there's tens and perhaps even 100,000s of dead, my hope would be that we really start taking diplomacy seriously and look for off-ramps for all sides. All sides have taken very strong positions. Off-ramps are needed. Right now, I can tell you that is not the atmosphere in Washington. There's not much appetite for that. Some of the narratives that Professor Eisenberg pointed out are very, very strong right now, but they're strong without the US actually committing itself to the warfare. Again, as she said, perhaps that would change, but to me, it seems to be wiser to go for these off-ramps right now before you have such a degree of bloodshed in which it simply will be politically impossible for almost any of the parties to engage in any compromise. And at the end of the day, there's going to have to be compromises from all sides on this issue, not just from both sides, but from all sides on this issue.
Another rather different question that is about the Quincy Institute. The student says, going back to what you said about the global elite, isn't the Quincy Institute funded by the Kochs and George Soros? Again, you'll probably be either flattered or offended by that to be included in the global elite.
Not offended at all. Our first press release made it very clear that as part of our effort to build a transpartisan bloc that favors a different grand strategy that is not based on military hegemony. This is not something you can do by just having Republicans on your side or having progressives on your side. You have to build a transpartisan alliance. And to show that this is now an idea that has matured to the point that there is not only political will, but also financial backing for both sides for it, we strategically made sure that we, as we were founding the Quincy Institute, that we went both to elements on the right and the left to get them to buy into this idea, and they did. Are they part of the elites? I'm sure they are. But talking about how the elites, to a very large extent, have disappointed, if not in the perspective of a lot of people out in the country, abandoned them, does not take away in any way, shape, or form that if you want to create an organization that can change this and have an impact in Washington, you have to be able to engage as many parties as possible in order to be able to bring about that change. What we're talking about here is a paradigm shift in American foreign policy thinking. That's not going to be easy, nor is it going to be done by only relying on one element of the political spectrum, or even go outside of the political spectrum to be able to achieve.
Great. And then here's a good question about your comments about the UN. A question I have about how Dr. Parsi mentioned that Russia is ignoring the UN which was increasingly the anarchic nature of international politics. Do you think that the UN is really a source of international order, or has ever been? I would argue that there is no body that provides any real order governing in international politics.
I think the questioner is quite correct in terms of not thinking that the UN itself as a body has the ability or the power to be able to constrain particularly great powers. And the United States, Russia, China would fall into that category. I think the questioner is, the student, I guess, is absolutely correct. That is not my argument. My argument is that at the end of the day, if you have enough of a consensus between the great powers about what the rules should be and what the institutions should be, then that creates constraints in the international system, norms that are costly to break. It doesn't mean that they're unbreakable. It doesn't mean that it guarantees some of the things we would like to see, but it means that it becomes costlier and more difficult for states to be able to break them or ignore them. It is better, in my view, to live in such a world, imperfect as it may be, than to live in a world in which we don't have any of those things. We don't even have a common perception of what the acceptable rules are at all. Under those circumstances, we're in a much worse situation. Let me make a reference to earlier on. I'm a columnist at MSNBC, and one of my recent columns on this issue raised the issue of the US's own position and how it has managed, not only in the last 25 years, but actually right now. The Biden administration talks a lot about the rules-based order, but increasingly to a lot of countries in the world, it looks like an order in which we rule rather than an order that is actually based on rules. And in recent address to the Security Council, when you read it carefully, there is a lot of emphasis on multilateral organizations and multilateralism, but not necessarily on the UN itself. And Biden officials have privately said to UN officials that when we're talking about a rules-based order, we're not talking about a UN-centric rules-based order, which then raises the question, if it's not centered on the UN, the Security Council, international law as it is embodied in, then what is it centered on? If it's just centered on American power, then in my view, there's not much of an order, and there's certainly not much of a rules-based order that we're talking about. I think that ultimately is bad for the world, but it's also going to be very, very bad for the United States itself. The previous system, which I have huge criticisms against, I worked in it, I served in the Security Council, nevertheless has the ability to constrain some of the worst things that happens in an anarchic system. And we are witnessing right now what the world will look like more and more if we further go down that path.
Back to Iran, a question that says Iran should not be given weapons. The civilians should be given refuge throughout the world. Their government, I'm assuming that means Iran's government, is dangerous.
Sorry, are we talking about Iran or?
This question was about Iran.
Okay.
Well, it obviously kind of jumped a bit to.
Could you repeat it, or
refuge around the world? I'm not sure.
Okay, so Iran should not be armed.
Yeah.
Okay, and then the next part of it was?
The civilians, I'm not sure if you're talking about the Iranian civilians or back to Ukraine. The civilians should be given refuge throughout the world. And then back to Iran, their government, I'm assuming this is referring to the Iranian government, is dangerous.
Got it. So first on the issue of not armed, I couldn't agree more. I absolutely agree. And very few countries are arming the Iranians. I mean, the JCPOA is in order to make sure that they don't have a pathway towards a nuclear weapon. I don't think that is sustainable, or as a whole, unless we actually also stop arming many other countries in the region. The United States is the #1 arms provider to the countries in the Middle East. Those countries, such as Saudi Arabia, the Emirates, Israel, consume far more American weaponry or weapons per se. The Saudis are outspending the Iranians with a factor of 8 when it comes to arms purchases. The Emiratis, even though it's a very small country, twice as much as what the Iranians are spending on military. We would be better off if we ourselves also stepped back and provided far less weapons to the Middle East as a whole. And that would, I think, also help make sure that bad weapons, or not just hardly any good weapons, but weapons also don't make it to Iran. In general, the deficit in the Middle East as a whole is not weapons. There's plenty of weapons. The deficit is dialogue, diplomacy, and a concerted effort to build a new security architecture for the region that in and of itself, again, similar to the UN system, creates a degree of rules within the region that can help guide security and guide the actions of states. Right now, the Middle East is one of the most deinstitutionalized regions in the world when it comes to having any type of international bodies that can help in, promote diplomacy, but also help with de-escalation of conflict.
Great. Two questions about the role of the American media. The first, do you think that the American media outlets are ethically and accurately covering Ukraine more versus how they have covered events in the Middle East? And then a follow-up from someone else saying, I don't think they are. As a foreigner who lives in a foreign country, American media outlets or Western outlets have always demonized non-democratic countries.
I don't have tremendously positive things to say about how media is covering, or the US media is covering, this or any other conflict. I have to watch my words carefully here, since it's difficult to talk about this without using some really, really strong words. I think it is absolutely horrific in general. It's not just in Ukraine, because there is such an effort to simplify and to sensationalize. Because we're selling news, we're not providing news. And that, I think, has a tremendously dangerous impact. And it creates a pressure on politicians so that they suddenly have to fend off some of the most ridiculous, unthought through proposals that are not coming from the public, but it's coming from journalists who want to elevate their own names in these things. I'm not going to name a specific person, but there was recently a tweet by a rather high-profile person in the U.S. media talking about that the convoy of Russian tanks, etc., are on their way into Ukraine. These can easily be taken out by a couple of precision strikes by the United States. Here's a moral dilemma. Will the United States just watch this happen? And it's really simplifying a tremendously complex geopolitical situation to a ridiculously simplified moral dilemma, which is a dimension that is not invalid in the larger context of things, but it's taking away everything else. We're talking about the United States striking Russian troops, and nuclear power. Are you going to feel better about where we stand morally when we're all dead in a nuclear war that would very likely follow something like that? There's an irresponsibility in which the way this is talked about that is then forcing politicians to have to take into account all kinds of really crazy proposals and feel pressured in that direction. And I do have to say this is not coming from the American public. It's not the American public that is pushing these type of lines. It's coming from a media that I think to a certain extent buys into some of these ideas of global hegemony, but to a very large extent are just there to sell news. And as a result, that sensationalism is valid for their bottom line, but it is horrific for US national interests.
Great.
And it has strongly contributed to the manner in which the American public increasingly mistrusts the news. It's not just one or two specific channels, it's in general. And that, I think, is one of the greatest threats to our democracy as a whole. When you have this constant, pervasive mistrust, there's no authoritative sources left. And that fuels all of this kind of conspiracy theory things that we're seeing right now that are tremendously dangerous to the very democracy here in the United States itself.
Great. And here's a related comment. The Vietnam syndrome was quickly resolved. I saw no evidence of an Afghanistan syndrome. Few even mentioned the lessons learned from Afghanistan. We quickly forget the horror and futility of war when the sabers start rattling and the rhetoric turns toxic. While tentative, I fear ultimately for the US military action and that remains on the table.
I think that's an excellent question. And I think I would go back to what I mentioned earlier on. I think that person is correct, that the lessons learned from Afghanistan have not been learned. It's not been taken seriously. We saw that again in the manner in which Afghanistan was covered in the last couple of months during the withdrawal. There was a tremendous amount of things going wrong. But again, instead of providing news, the news channels tended to provide opinion on what should or should not be done, which is a significant misread of their actual role in these matters. And to the extent that they provide it, it has to be very clearly said, this is opinion and this is news coverage. We have completely blurred those lines. But I think one thing that is perhaps even worse is that we have not even had that type of introspection of how come we now know, thanks to the Pentagon Papers, that the US government systematically lied to the American public about how the war went and what was needed to win. And we were constantly told that just 6 more months, we're going to turn the corner, whereas clearly they knew that was not the case. Very much reflective of what happened during Vietnam and the documents that came out of that. What we haven't asked is, how could this go on for 20 years without the US media, sometime in the middle of it, actually starting investigating this and asking the tough, right questions to get to the bottom of it? Something like this can only go along for 20 years if you have a media that is not doing its job and it's not asking the tough questions. So the media, in my view, has a significant responsibility, because oftentimes they were just parroting what the US government was saying in this and not scrutinizing it. And rightly, they have pushed back when Biden administration officials in some recent State Department hearings were pushing back against journalists who were frankly asking good questions and wanting to see evidence for things. And there was an insinuation that if you don't believe us, you're with Putin or you're with ISIS. I mean, this is horrible. This should not be done. The media was right in pushing back against that. But we can't, praise ourselves for these isolated, occasional questioning of government lines and asking for more evidence. This needs to be a systematic, constant thing that is done by the media. And if it was, I don't think we would be in a situation in which, forget about not learning the lessons from Afghanistan, we haven't even learned how we managed to end up doing this for 20 years without any questions being asked.
Again, we're running out of time and have just a flurry.
I do have to run right now because I have a meeting that starts in 30 seconds.
Then we thank you profoundly for helping us think critically and hopefully with some optimism in terms of acting in solidarity with people who believe in a better world around the world. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much. My pleasure. Thank you.